Let's get OBS fired up. And yes, great. So hi, welcome to Philosophy of Language. I'm Nathan. I think probably run into everyone at some point in time, but anyway, I'm Nathan Wellman. It's lovely to see you all. Thank you guys very much for coming, especially given all the trains and all the joys that we're all going through at the moment. The first thing to note, of course, given that Philip sends his regards, apologies, he's not going to be able to do the course. So I took over quite late in the day. Basically found out I was going to do the course about a month or so ago. This is actually a course I've been basically pleading with Vim to be able to teach, so I'm super fucking psyched to do it. But also, it was thrown together absolutely last minute with no idea about your guys' background or what you're prepared for. So we'll figure this out as we go. I think it'll be fun. Plan for today is very simple. I don't think we're going to use up the whole time, anywhere close to the whole time. I want to talk to you about some admin and practicalities, basically how things are going to work. A quick, 2-slide bit on what is philosophy of language. Hey, come here. A crash through our topic list, what we're going to do each week, all of those sorts of things. And then I want to end with some actual content. I want to talk about what we might think of as a kind of almost a very natural, but jokingly we might call an idealistic picture of language that comes, well, it doesn't really come from Locke, but Locke perfectly expresses it. And then another view, often attributed to John Stuart Mill, probably much older than that, about how to understand proper names, so a specific kind of singular term. That's the plan. As I say, I don't think we're going to use the whole time. So is everyone okay if we just kind of press all the way through and then we just end when we end, instead of aiming for a break or anything? Cool. So usually for most lectures and things, if I think we're going to use the whole time, what I'll do is I'll ask you right at the beginning, would you rather have a break or would you rather end early? But I figured today we'll probably go for about an hour and then we can all go home. Well, you guys can go home. I got another fucking lecture. So that's the plan. Here's the first thing I want to ask before even doing the admin and practicalities. How many of you have actually done stuff in philosophy of language before? So did you guys all do Sandar's course on the history of analytic philosophy? No? Okay. Good. Sandar? Or the history of analytic philosophy class that's in the second year? From Miguel, yes. Igler, yeah. It's all been moved around. Yeah. Oh, this is even better. Good. So, fresh young clay. Good. So I'm going to assume basically next to nothing with regards to background. That being said, because this is technically a third-year course, we're going to go real fast. So we're going to cover a lot of stuff in a very short amount of time. It's cool. We'll figure it out as we go. Okay. So here are the admin and practicalities bit. Here's the course learning goals. I'm not going to read that because that's way too boring. Here's the gist of it. There's 5 or 6 broad topics. I want you to learn some stuff about all the broad topics. That's what this says in some fancy erudite way of saying. More specifically, the course materials. There's a syllabus. It's on the Canvas page. Please give it a read. It gives you all of the details of how things will work. All of the relevant literature I've uploaded to Canvas already. It's all on PDFs. It's all there. I need to make some selections. So I think I uploaded the whole of Naming and Necessity. I'm not going to make you read that, even though it's an easy read. Things like this. So we'll talk a little bit more about which specific bits to read as we go. Usually each week there'll be something like 1 article. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more. So I think week 3 there's technically 3 articles, but one of them is a page long. So it's not going to be too hard. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you go, they're often quite dense. So the one we're going to read next week, Frigg, is on sense and reference. Just as an example, I have a buddy of mine who did an MA course in Hamburg, 16-week course, they just read that one article. They spent the whole time going through, didn't even get past the third fucking page, which is ridiculous. But there's a lot of stuff to talk about there. Often the texts are what we might think of as canonical texts, at least in analytic philosophy of language. I mean, to be honest, you can probably even drop the of language bit there. A lot of the things we're going to go through really are, as Morris mentions in one of his introductions to philosophy of language, these are the kind of crown jewels of analytic philosophy. At least some of them are. So, hence you can see one of the reasons why I wanted to teach this course. I love these things. What I'm going to ask you to do is just, read the papers before the lecture. Otherwise, it's going to be a little bit boring. What we'll try and do is something like a kind of running discussion. Right? I'll get up here and say some stuff about how I think the paper goes and what problems I think it has and things like this, and we'll have a conversation about it. Make sense? By now, you guys know how this stuff works, right? Everybody's familiar. So, the lectures will be in person with backup recordings, provided it works. Tuesdays, 2:45, you know that, you're here now. Note there's one exception. On the 20th of September, it's 2 hours earlier. I have no idea why, that's just what they do. So, generally check my timetable to see which room you're in, what time, and all of that stuff. They have changed things on me at the very last minute before, so be on your toes. Attendance is recommended, not mandatory. I am not going to keep attendance. It's beyond my pay grade to do that. The aim, as I mentioned, is kind of part lecture, part discussion. I want to talk about this stuff with you. I genuinely find some of these problems absolutely fascinating. I'm curious to, basically I want to show you my Pokemon and I want to hear what you guys think about them. Okay. Now, of course, you're probably wondering, how am I going to test you? How am I going to assess you? How are you going to get your grade? Let me stress, I had no hand in fixing the format here. This was given to me. It was already settled before I even got put in charge of the course. So there's two parts. There's some written assignments and an exam. Let me know, the exam is a literal, like, you've got to go to the hall, sit down, and write answers exam. That's what Philip wanted, that's how it is. So, basically, those of you who did the logic class with me will know how this goes. There's 100 points going. Right? I don't care where you get your points from, all that matters to pass is that you get 55 or more. So, right, you can ace the written assignments, get a 35 on the final exam, bang, you passed, good job. So, no minimum score in any relevant bit. Let's talk about the parts, though. What are the assignments? So the assignments are two what we'll call critical analyses of about 750 to 1,000 words each. Basically, what I want you to do is take an argument from one of the readings that we've had, spell it out to me, critically evaluate it, raise some objections, talk about maybe a problem with it, talk about how you might justify one of the premises that doesn't have it, and then think about how what you've just done impacts the overall debate that this is a part of. Does that kind of make sense? Now is the time to say no if it doesn't. So, you might, for example, next week we're going to talk about Frege on identity statements. You might say, okay, here's Frege's argument, why or how identity statements can be informative. Here's a problem with it. It doesn't explain these kinds of cases. So what does this mean? It looks like maybe we still need something more with regards to how identity statements work. Bang, beautiful, 10 out of 10, touchdown Jesus. Not really a lot here, just if you kind of do them and they have the basic structure, awesome, you're going to get a 10. I'll share some suggested topics. I'll put that on Canvas in the next couple weeks as things get a little closer. The due date, they're due on the 15th of November. They're both due the 15th of November. Submit them through assignments. Again, hopefully you all know how this stuff works. If you have questions, let me know. Cool? Okay. The exam is a written exam. There'll be some open questions. It'll be, I think, the second week of December, first or second week of December. I'm not entirely sure yet. There'll be open questions on the material discussed. I'll give you a review sheet with some sample questions. The questions that will be on the exam will be very similar in structure to the ones on the sample sheet. Yeah, again, this isn't the format that I would have necessarily picked. It's the one I inherited, so we're going to make it work. I'll put this in the next few weeks up on Canvas, let you know. We'll make sure to talk about it when it comes up, all of that sort of stuff. And that's basically it for assessment. Are there any questions on that? Is it clear? Again, if you have any, feel free to mention them now. Or you can always email me or message me on Canvas. Again, you're all seasoned veterans at this point. You know how this stuff works. Okay, cool. That's it really for admin and practicalities. All the stuff's on the Canvas page. All the stuff will basically be done through Canvas page or here in person, in Meet Space. So let's talk about philosophy of language. Put really bluntly, I think philosophy of language is one of the few places where philosophy has actually made some progress. We started off with some really, really dumb views. That's a bit harsh. We started off with some intuitive but bad views. And we've gotten a lot better. Now, what is philosophy of language? Well, shockingly, it's thinking philosophically about things like what language is and how language works. Notably, the kinds of questions that don't really come up here anymore are things about syntax, linguistic structure. That's because, well, that bit of philosophy of language went on and became linguistics. So the kind of things that we're often interested in as philosophers of language are questions like, what is a language? Or what are the minimum conditions you need in order to be a language? What is it for a language or parts of a language to have anything like meaning? So if I say the word Tilburg, right, somehow it denotes like this place? But how the hell does it do that? Right? Does it do that? It feels like it does. It feels like that's the kind of thing I would use to like track, maybe not exactly here-ish. Maybe the words even have meaning. What the hell is meaning anyway? The sort of semantic notion here is weird and elusive, and fleshing that out or trying to make sense of it is one of the core activities in philosophy of language. And then we might also ask what the meaning of a particular part of speech is. So what's the meaning of a singular term? Quick question. What's a singular term? Or what do you think? How about we'll go with an even easier one. What's an example of a singular term? What do we think? Don't worry, it's not a trick. Yeah.
Really like free because it's a everyone knows what free is. So really there's no discussion.
Yeah, good. So no, right, what we're not really talking about is we're not kind of getting or trying to get to the thing, whatever the hell the number 3 is, but 3, the number 3. Here's another one. Nathan, Tilburg, Willensveen. The worst team in the Eredivisie. Right? Cool. All of these are singular terms. What do they do? Or what do they at least purport to do? Let's think about it. What's the kind of common thing amongst all of them?
They refer to something.
Yeah. They refer, in particular, they're trying to pick out one thing, right? So, cool. Here's another one. Hey, come on in. Santa Claus. Santa Claus is a singular term, right? It tries to reach out into the world and find an object. Fails, because dreams destroyed, there is no Santa, right? But it's still a singular term. It purports to pick out some particular object. Contrast that with, say, universities, or dog, right? Or human being. Right? Note, these kinds of things aren't singular. They're not trying to pick out or denote a single object. They're general terms. They denote something like a kind or a type. So we might ask, what's the meaning of a given general term? Or we might even ask, what's the meaning of the? Which, again, people who did the logic course with me will hopefully remember how to cash that out. So this is something we'll talk a little bit about. Right? And you might think there's a tight relationship here between what is it for a language to have meaning and a bunch of these particular questions. Maybe if we figure out all of these, we can then work backwards to get meaning at the whole level of language. So the big, deep, underlying question, I think, is what's the relationship between this representational tool, language, this series of noises I'm making at you, and the world. This stuff, the kickable shit. How can these sort of weird noises and squiggles somehow get us to this stuff? That's the deep, dark, weird question. It's really hard. But figuring that out will probably help us a lot with, say, epistemology and metaphysics and every other damn thing we're interested in as philosophers. Hence why philosophy of language is often taken to be very fundamental. Now, I should say, in the 60s and 70s, especially over in Plague Island in the UK, some philosophers thought that was all of philosophy. Everything was just philosophy of language. And if we're very careful about how we analyze language, in particular, really, they mean English, because as the Economist says, this is the language that God understands. God being the dollar. Well, then we can solve every single philosophical problem. It's all just language, as long as we're careful about analysis. Probably a slight exaggeration. Slight here in the very British sense of a massive exaggeration. But the cool thing is it does seem like a lot of problems could be at least clarified or better understood if we have a grip in philosophy of language. If we understand or have an answer to that big, deep, dark underlying question. Cool. Okay. So philosophy of language has occupied a kind of central position in philosophy. It still does. And many of the most influential philosophers in the 20th century, both in the analytic and the continental tradition, have really focused on or at least worked in philosophy of language. So that's the kind of sales pitch for why we should be interested in it. Hopefully it's kind of clear, at least vaguely, what some of the questions are. So let's talk about, let's talk about some of the topics we'll cover. So the way I decided to do the topics was basically, I just went like, cool, what would be like, so we have the course Beyond the Canon. What would be the canon? Or something like it. At least with regards to this particular topic. So that's what I've tried to do in some sort of way. So we're going to start off by talking about Frege and Frege's philosophy of language. To be honest, Frege is often thought to be the founder of analytic philosophy as an approach. It's certainly true that Frege invented modern logic, and arguably Frege's views about how language works have formed or informed pretty much everything that's happened afterwards. Really kind of amazing. So we're going to start with him. He's got some weird views, but it's a place to start. So that's what we're going to talk about next week. We're going to read his paper on sense and reference. From Frege, we're going to move to Russell. In particular, Russell's theory of descriptions, which is, again, trying to wrestle with the same puzzles that Frege's really after, but he's going to come at it in a very different way. These guys were very closely in contact with each other. We'll talk a little bit about their relationship, but that's also something we'll talk about in History of Analytic with Miguel. From Russell, we'll turn to Kripke. Now, this is so. Kripke was famous basically because at 16, he formalized and proved the soundness and completeness of a particular version of modal logic. He was offered a position at MIT, and he wrote back and said, "My dad says I have to finish high school first." Kripke's an amazing formal logician. Also has some very interesting ideas about philosophy of language. In particular, what he managed to do was revive a view that was thought long dead. We'll talk a little bit about the Millian theory at the end of today. But broadly, these three, we're going to really focus on how singular terms work. What are the meanings of singular terms? That'll be sort of not the only thing, but that's the kind of core topic for those first three meetings. Then in week 5, we're going to turn to a very weird puzzle about belief. This is, again, closely related to singular terms, though it's not entirely. And it's about how you can know one thing in multiple different descriptions and have effectively different knowledge claims with regards to it. So that'll be the next 4 weeks. After that, we're going to turn to topics on kind of use, meaning, and intention. So what we'll do is we'll first, in week 6, talk about speech act theory. So this is developed by Austin and Searle, but puts a particularly good use by Ray Langton, and she talks about pornography as a particular kind of speech act. So what we'll do in this week is get the basics of speech act theory through, and then talk about Langton's application, because I think it's a very helpful way to get a grip on the theory. And from Langton, we'll then expand back out, just from speech acts, to think about meaning in general. So are people relatively familiar, or have you heard of Paul Grice before? Have you heard of the notion of an implicature? Here's the cheap and cheery way. So suppose, you guys know Alfred, right? Suppose Alfred asked me for a letter of recommendation for something. And in my letter of recommendation, I said, Alfred's very tall, he can run quickly, and he knows how to tie his shoes. Right? Now, what's the letter say? Well, the letter says some nice things about Alfred. What does it not say? What does it convey? Well, I probably don't think terribly highly of his philosophical abilities, say. So there's a kind of conveyance there. It's said, even though it's not actually part of what is said. That's an example. I think Alfred's great, amazing, just very good. So what we're going to talk about with 7 and 8 is Grice's program here. It ties down directly to intentions and uses intentions and this notion of what we call pragmatics to kind of flesh out that implicature story and related things. Another really good example here is if I say Brittany got pregnant and had a baby. Brittany got pregnant and got married. There's a kind of suggestion of a temporal order, though strictly speaking, there isn't a requirement there. That could just be the order that I said them in, rather than the order that actually happened. So cool. That's going to be these 3 weeks. And then the last 2 weeks, I called them weird cases. This is basically just me, I'm going to talk to you about these really weird things. So week 9 will be about empty names and negative existentials. And week 10 will be about private languages and the rule-following paradox. So let's go through these one at a time. Anybody want to take a shot in the dark, figure out what do we mean by an empty name? We even had an example of one earlier. Yeah, right? So what would be an example? Yeah, Santa Claus, right? So Santa Claus is a singular term. It functions as a singular term. I can say things like, Santa wears a red hat. Looks like it's meaningful. But how can it be meaningful if there ain't no Santa? Here's an even weirder puzzle, right? So that's just using the empty name. How would I say Santa doesn't exist? Because it looks like I need Santa, the word, to have some meaning. But if he doesn't exist, then it doesn't refer to anything, so what the hell is the meaning? It looks like I can't say that Santa doesn't exist anymore, because I need him to be there in order for the word Santa to have any meaning at all. Do we see the puzzle? It's weird. I'm going to tell you right now, no one has a good answer. They all suck. But it's fun to figure out why they all suck. That's why it's interesting. And then the last thing, so the private language and rule following paradox. Some of you might have come across some of this before. The basic issue here is that once we actually try and cash out any kind of notion of meaning, it's very hard to see why it is that everyone's actually doing the same thing when we do addition. Most of us can't actually cash out what addition is. You can't give me a formal definition for how it works. And even if you can, there's no reason to think that that is the rule that everyone is applying. So we'll talk a little bit about this and why this has some pretty significant impacts. So that'll be the kind of fun stuff we'll end on. Okay. Before taking on, just quickly stop and ask, are there any questions about the topics or anything like that? Is there anything that people were really hoping we would talk about that wasn't on this list? I mean, you were expecting the class with Philip. You're probably expecting game theory. So, I hope this is interesting. Genuinely, a bunch of these puzzles, I cannot stop thinking about them since I started thinking about this. God, 20 years. Never mind. I'm not going to finish that sentence. Yeah, I think some of these are just absolutely amazing. They're super fun puzzles, and I think the fun part about them is the fact that they're so puzzling. Unfortunately, well, hopefully by this point you're familiar with this, but unfortunately there's probably not going to be too many good answers. But that's all right. That's kind of part of the fun. So, the last thing I wanted to do, the last two things I wanted to do, was to fill in some background. In particular, I wanted to talk about one, I jokingly called it an idealistic view of language. It's also a very natural view of language. It's one that I think a lot of people go in with. And it's really the view that most of the things we're going to talk about are acting against. So it's the kind of starting point that everyone says, well, it can't be that, so we must find something else. So I want to talk about that for maybe, let's call it 15 minutes. And I got a couple slides on millionism about singular terms, and we can all go home happy. Sounds good? One other thing that I forgot to put in the slides, but I want to talk about, is does everyone know the difference between use and mention? So a few heads could do it. Anybody remember it at all? I know we talked a little bit about it way back in the logic class. So we actually even had an issue about it just a second ago. We were talking about 3. So this is something that's actually important for us to get clear on as we go along. So, here's the way we can draw it out. Is we can use, let's just use my name because I'm selfish. So one of the things we can do with any word is we can use it, that is, use it to try and get to whatever it's about, or it means, or that it refers to. Or we can talk about the word. Nathan has 2 A's. Well, if we use that, talking about me, well, as far as I know, I don't have 2. But if we talk about my name, cool. So how do we do the demarcation? When we use a word, we go through it. It's like a door. You go through it to the object you want to get to, if we're talking about names in this case. If we mention it, then we want to talk about that bit of language itself. Do we see the difference? So, Tilburg is a city in the Netherlands. Cool. Tilburg is a city in the Netherlands. Nah, it's a word, man. The way we often mark it off, you put the quotes. Put the quotes around the word, that means you're talking about the word, not about what the word is about. So that's an important distinction. So to come back, we were talking about, right, 3. Well, not the number, man. Right? It's 3. That's the thing, that's the singular term. We have to mention the singular term to talk about it. If we want to talk about the object, we use it. Now, this use-mention distinction is really important. One area where it's vital is if you're interested in the semantics of slurs or pejorative language. Obviously, this is an interesting topic. It's something that a lot of philosophers of language are really keen on. Problem, if there was no use-mention distinction, they would be some of the worst motherfuckers around. Because they'd be throwing around this language all the time. And that's bad. So one of the tools we have in our arsenal is to make this move. To say, I want to talk about the word, I don't want to talk about what the word means. Now that's something that we'll need to be careful about. So if there's an ambiguity, must be clear. Okay, so that's one background thing. Worth knowing. Yeah, all right, let's talk about the ideal view. So here's a really long quote from Locke. I am unfortunately going to read it. I'm really sorry. I couldn't find a way to shorten it. So the reason to have this quote from Locke isn't because he's the originator of the view, but he summarizes it quite nicely, just in this little paragraph. So, man, though he have great variety of thoughts, and such from which others, as well as himself, might receive profit and delight, yet they are all within his own breast, invisible and hidden from others, nor can of themselves be made appear. The comfort and advantage of society not being to be had without communication of thoughts, it's necessary that man should find out some sensible external sayings, whereby those indivisible ideas, which his thoughts are made up of, might be made known to others. For this purpose, nothing was so fit, either for plenty or quickness, as those articulate sounds, with which so much ease and variety he found himself able to make. Thus we may conceive how words, which were by nature so well adapted to that purpose, come to be made use of by men as the signs of their ideas, not by any natural connection that there is between particular articulate sounds and certain ideas, for then there would be but one language amongst all men, but by a voluntary imposition, whereby such a word is made arbitrarily the mark of such an idea. Oh, missed that one. The use then of words is to be sensible marks of ideas, and the ideas they stand for are their proper and immediate signification. So first things first, that's a hell of a paragraph. So what's the idea, lurking here? Well, there's a bunch. Let me pick out a few. Here are, I think, some of the claims that are made in this paragraph. First one is the nature of language is defined by its function. And its function is effectively to communicate. And what's communicated, or what language is intended to communicate, is something like thoughts. Now, related to this is an idea that, hey, words mean the components of what language is meant to communicate. The components of thoughts are ideas. Now, he hit that a lot. Right, so I'll go back real quick. We'll come back to these. I just want to go back to the paragraph. Conceive words came to purpose as the signs of their ideas. Now note, other than the one that I forgot, Locke very helpfully italicized all of the occurrences of idea. That's because he's using this in a very technical term way. It's not some loosey-goosey conception of what an idea is. He means something very close to like a mental picture. So Locke's basic thought is that words are linked up to particular mental pictures. And language is designed to help us convey these mental pictures to each other. I think there's a really natural kind of view here. Language is supposed to facilitate communication. What are we communicating? We're communicating thoughts. What are thoughts made up of? Shit in our head. And the words stand for the stuff that's in my head. And I'm trying to get the stuff from here to all of you. The trick is I can't just get you straight to my mental pictures. The best I can do is get it to you via words. And of course, the fact that I'm using the particular sounds that I am, well, that's just arbitrary. There's nothing essential or special about, the sequence of sounds Tilburg that makes it pick out this place. There's no kind of necessary connection between a word and the thing it is a signifier for. Okay. Again, big paragraph, lots of stuff in there, but I think we can kind of pull it apart. So the core idea here is, again, words express ideas in this really heavy Lockean sense of idea, and ideas aren't going to be immediately perceivable. We can't just transmit them or get them from each other. So, before we trundle on, the basic idea, I almost said the basic idea. Is the basic thought here kind of clear? Plausible? I mean, it seems kind of like it makes sense, right? I think this is, something like this seems kind of sensible. Maybe there's some nits to pick and we need to be a little bit more careful, but it's kind of plausible. Here's the trick. If we understand language in this way, it cannot perform its function. If this is how language really works, then it cannot perform its function. Why?
Well, you need the others. So, yeah, some people have to perceive your idea of a certain word. So, yeah, so yeah, if one idea cannot be perceived by another, then you immediately can communicate with another because that idea cannot be perceived. So, yeah, you just talk,
Just make a noise.
It's just that.
You might as well be whistling.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's the basic idea. Again, bad joke. Let's try and unpack it a little bit. Yeah.
But I can't remember the text of law, but on proposition 6 that you made out of it.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but isn't he trying to say like you cannot directly perceive my ideas since it is my mental picture?
Yes.
But if he says that the words can express my ideas, then it's out there. Then I externalize my ideas. But I'm not sure. I can't remember correctly.
Well, so importantly, note what we wouldn't be externalizing is the idea. So if we can externalize the idea, well, then others can perceive it. Instead, what they can perceive is some word that has an arbitrary connection to whatever idea I'm trying to convey. So this is the flip to it. Right? If words are somehow supposed to allow us to get to the idea, there needs to be a connection. Problem, if the connection is completely arbitrary, there ain't no reason to think we're ever going to actually get to that idea. So here's a way to kind of catch it. It looks like communication involves something like mutual understanding. And you might think a minimum condition on mutual understanding involves knowing what the other person means, or at least having a grip on what the other person means. Of course, what they mean can't be immediately grasped. That's exactly what we just heard a second ago, right? That's just point 6. One's ideas can't be perceived by others. They're in here, you can't get to them, same vice versa. Cool. Well, we could use words, but there's no reliable connection between given instances of words and ideas. Because ideas are particular, they're individual, they're not shared. Because if they were, then this would be false. Ideas are localized. And it's this notion of idea. Well, if we had some sort of reliable relation between words and ideas, then cool, I'd be able to get it. But of course, we don't really. It's not like words are inherently meaningful. The connection is arbitrary. We just stipulated, we made it up. It's contingent. So there's no justification for linking the use of any particular word to any particular idea. Hence, there's no real communication. Because I'm never going to be in a position to know what you meant.
So then communication would be when you directly understand the other's idea. That's communication.
If we buy this picture, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the only person you could really communicate with
Yourself.
is yourself. Right? Now, the flip to this is, and some people take this as just like, cool, yeah, there is no communication. I mean, people believe anything. But you could just have, well, it's a very lonely communicating language. Though we will come eventually, so this is the last week, we'll talk a little bit about a problem with this notion of a private language. And how arguably it's not even a language at all. It's a neat little trick, this issue. And the problem is, this picture I think is really seductive. It's nice. And it makes sense. So we're caught in this rock and hard place. It seems pretty clear that we can't get our ideas out. People can't perceive them. God, it would be so much easier if we could. But it also seems like we can manage to kind of communicate somehow. So we're going to have to kind of work against this idealistic view. And you can see the pun now, hopefully, in why I call it an idealistic view. It's based on this thought that what we're expressing with words or with thoughts are particular localized concepts, localized ideas. So one of the upshots we might take from this is that meaning what you know, or meaning is what you know when you understand a word, and understanding doesn't involve knowing the psychological associations a particular person has with that word. Or to put another way, whatever meaning is, it can't just be a matter of what particular people happen to think of when they hear or read or use a given word. That you have particular associations with the word Tilburg, cool. That's interesting. That tells me something about your psychology. Doesn't necessarily tell me anything about the meaning of the word. Particular ideas might be useful and helpful, but they don't seem to be at least all of what meaning is. The trick is going to be figuring out what the hell the rest of it might be. So here are some alternative pictures. Basically, we might just replace some of the options that were in that list. Here's the first one. This is Frege's idea. Hey, Locke was broadly on the right notion, but instead of ideas, which are particularized, localized individuals, what words really express, or the components of thoughts, are concepts or senses. These are shared, they're public, and they're the things that allow us to triangulate and assess meaning. So this is what we're going to talk about next week, Frege's view. Frege has a whole bunch of other things, but this is kind of the core. Is we move away from these localized ideas to talk about concepts, which are shareable. Another option, Russell, is, okay, actually, Locke was wrong when he said that what language is meant to communicate is thought. It's not thoughts, it's facts. Things out in the world. True propositions. We don't care about what's going on in your head. We care about this stuff. And the correlate to this is, okay, actually, the component of these things aren't words. It's objects and properties. Things and qualities. And words are just a way for us to get down to these things. And the structure of facts will then tell us something about the structure of language, but there isn't a perfect mirror. This is what we're going to talk about in 2 weeks' time. Now, let me just, again, say, I think this sort of ideal picture is really seductive. It's really lovely. And the problem with it is an interesting one, and put real blunt, it's something like it's going to come back up for everybody too. There aren't really lovely, beautiful answers yet. There might be better or worse ways to approach this, but there are some issues. Okay, cool, still on time. One other option you might go with, and this is in response to some of the difficulties, is you might adopt what's sometimes called a referential view. So this is a kind of parody of what Mill brought. There might be something like this in some other writings of Locke. Aristotle might have had something like this with at least some bits of language. The referential view says, hey, words have their meaning because they stand for things, right? And the meaning of a term is the thing it stands for. So, what's the meaning of Mira? Well, I pick up my dog and I shake it at her, right? What's the meaning of Nathan? What's the meaning of Tilburg? So the meanings of words would then just be the things that they stand for. Has anyone read Gulliver's Travels? So the Lagedonians have a language like this, where basically they just have things be their own names. So the person with the strongest back has the biggest vocabulary because they can carry the most stuff. Right? Now there's something kind of interesting about this referential view. It's a very naive view. You might think as a kind of immediate knee-jerk reaction to the problem with the ideal approach. The problem with the referential view is it just don't work. Right? So one problem is there seem to be lots of words that look like they have meaning that don't seem to stand for things. Pegasus looks like it has a meaning, but there is no such thing. Is a horse is a bit of language that seems to be meaningful, but doesn't really feel like it stands for a thing. What would is a horse refer to? The property of horsiness, I guess? Or here's some other bits. The words a, or the, or and, or very. It seems hard to think of what sort of object or thing these might be words for. So, if this works, it might only work for certain parts of language, not for all. But here's a deeper, darker problem. And this was one that some of the absolute greats of analytic philosophy spent a bunch of time worrying about. On this referential view, sentences are just lists. And there's a big difference here. So, Socrates is wise looks like it's a meaningful sentence. Socrates being wisdom, cool, that's an interesting list you got going there, but it doesn't seem to convey it. It just looks like a bunch of words listed down. So here's the trick. What's the difference? Why does this express something? Why is this a meaningful sentence? Why is this just a mere list? And note, it wouldn't really matter if we replaced being with is. If we just took this as a list. Yeah?
Maybe that the unity of the words adds something. So the whole is not equal to the, how do you say it, to add the parts.
Sure. There's something else. What's the something else?
I would say structure.
Well, so, I mean, if it's just structure, right, it seems weird that we somehow lost the structure just because I added some comma. Again, if you don't like this being, replace it with is. But there's something funny here, right? And again, this is a big problem for the referential view because they just think it is nothing but lists. And here's the last one. We'll talk about this more in just a second. But there look like there might be sort of non-referential uses even of terms that are referential. So here's an example. Everybody knows, right? Superman is Clark Kent. So take Lois Lane. It seems true that Lois believes Clark Kent is a reporter. But Superman is Clark Kent, right? So presumably Lois believes that Superman's a reporter? No, that don't seem right. Lois doesn't believe that Superman's a reporter. She believes Kent is a reporter. She thinks Superman can fly. She doesn't think Kent can fly. But they're the same dude. Kent is Superman. So what's going on there? It can't just be the mere reference because it's the same guy in both cases. So this is a problem if we just have this basic referential view. Now, let me just mention, this problem is one we're going to keep coming back to, at least for 4 weeks. It's a funny problem, and it's actually really hard to figure out how to make sense of it. So, that's the kind of ideal view done. That's a little bit about the referential view. Last 10 minutes or so here, talking about a view that we'll need to have in our back pocket in order to talk about Frege. So, mentioned earlier, singular terms. Right? Singular terms of items of language that purport to denote individual objects. So proper names, definite descriptions, definite pronouns. So like this, or that, or I. You in the singular. Now, singular terms are interesting because, again, what's their function? Their function is to somehow take us from the term to a particular individual. Whatever it is, we don't necessarily care, right? But they get us to something. So here's the question. How do they work? What's their meaning? Now, John Stuart Mill suggests that the meaning of a proper name just is its referent. He says, proper name is a word that answers the purpose of showing what thing it is that we're talking about, but not of telling anything about it. So actually there's two bits there, right? What it does and what it doesn't do. So what does it do? Well, it gets us to the thing, whatever it's a name for. What does it not do? It doesn't tell us anything substantive about it. We don't learn anything about what it's like. Find out my dog's name is Mira, what did you learn? Well, my dog's name is Mira. You don't know anything else about her. The name doesn't tell you anything substantive. It's just a tag. But the name still works. You can go use the name Mira. You can say, hey, Nathan talked about his dog Mira. Cool. You're somehow using the name to get to my furry buddy, despite the fact that you don't really have any substantive descriptions attached. That's kind of neat. So this Millionism view is very close to the referential view, but it's a restriction of it. It's just about proper names, not about all words. And this was a view that a lot of people liked. But of course, as with all views, right, it has problems. So what we're going to end on is talking about 4 problems. And these are problems that we're going to kind of bring up quite a bit. Here are 4 problems for millions. The first one is one we've already talked about. It looks like we can make meaningful referent or purported referent to non-existence. I can say things like, Holmes is a detective. And whether we think that's true or false, it looks like it's at least meaningful. And the problem is, of course, that there is no Holmes. But if the meaning of this term is what it refers to, this should be about as meaningful as going, "Ah." So something's wrong. We've got to figure out what's going on here. Here's the second one, very closely related. Mentioned it earlier. Negative existentials. Holmes doesn't exist. Pegasus doesn't exist. Looks like those are true. But of course, those seem to use the very name that we're saying doesn't refer to anything. But if the referent is the meaning, then we should not be able to use that name because it would have no meaning. So there's our top two puzzles. Both of them have to do with something really funny about when we talk about things that don't exist. Whether we want to say they don't exist or just talk about them, even if it's going to be false. The second two have to do with some funny things about how identity and substitution work. So in order to kind of get the first one, which is Frege's puzzle about identity, it asks, does anyone know who Robert Allen Zimmerman is? So here's something really boring. Robert Allen Zimmerman is Robert Allen Zimmerman. You learned a lot right there, didn't you? Here's something much more interesting. Robert Allen Zimmerman is Bob Dylan. That's his first name. That's his real name. So here's something weird. I just told you the same thing twice. I told you Robert Allen Zimmerman is Robert Allen Zimmerman, and Robert Allen Zimmerman is Bob Dylan. But if the singular term just is the referent, I just said the same thing twice. So here's Frege's puzzle. How can some identity statements be informative? Because if they're true, they shouldn't be informative. It's the same fucking thing. Here's the second puzzle. We actually have already seen it with Lois and Clark, but we can talk about it just with Robert Zimmerman, right? Arguably, before I just blew your minds with that deep, dark fact about singer-songwriters, you believed that Dylan was a singer-songwriter. You probably didn't believe that Zimmerman was, or didn't have any beliefs at all about Zimmerman. Problem, they're the same dude. So why can't I just substitute in? It looks like this was true. This was not true. But that's weird because they're the same guy. If names, the meaning of proper names just are the things they denote, there is no space for a difference here. These are the same thing. But that's not possible because you learned something with one of them. Yeah.
But isn't using surname a bit tricky? Because I know also Robert Zimmerman, and yeah, then
Sure.
you know you have to remove it.
Yeah, so there's a kind of simplification assumption here, right? And actually one of the puzzles we'll talk about is Pierre and Pierre. So yeah, but there's a kind of simplification here where we're thinking that the term is just always picking out a single individual. Again, we can kind of set that aside for use of assumptions. Okay. So these are 4 puzzles. They're weird, they're hard. How to make sense of this apparent reference to non-existence, how to make sense of negative existentials, how to talk about Frege's puzzle, how can some identity statements be genuinely informative, and what do we do with these weird substitution cases? The referential view, the Millian view that we've been talking about, this kind of view, really struggles. Enter Frege. Frege tells us a story that's designed to solve these puzzles. And it's also designed to deal with a bunch of the issues that we saw with the ideal theory. Frege's move is going to add this notion of concepts. And concepts are going to do all of the heavy lifting to solve these puzzle cases and to get us where we can have same-say, where we can have communication. So what we're going to do, we're going to read Frege's On Sense and Reference. I would really suggest the first 5 or 6 pages. Really focus on that. It gets a little weird as it goes on, but give the whole paper a go. That's what we'll talk about next week. I will put out the sample questions probably next week or week after for the little critical analyses and things like that. Obviously, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or message me on Canvas or anything like that. Thanks for coming, guys. Take care. Have a lovely afternoon.